Our topic for today's presentation is this concept of building an agentic demand blueprint for your B2B go-to-market organization. We want to really talk about the future, where we're headed in terms of best-in-class agentic demand engine. But we also want to talk about where we've come from, the current state of marketing automation, and really what this hybrid transitional state looks like. And so that'll be the goal of our conversation here. Our focus is really on that 2.0 state of agentic demand and building an agentic demand engine. But we're going to first take a step back and talk a little bit about how do we get here? Talk a little bit about marketing automation roots. What has changed? What hasn't? And then we're going to talk about where we go next. And particularly, as I said before, what this transitional hybrid state looks like over the next year, year and a half, 2 years. So I think the starting place is really marketing automation 1.0. And for me, I feel like that really harkens back to earlier in my career. Before founding Annuitas, I was actually the B2B demand generation marketing automation evangelist at Silverpop. And so as I was putting this presentation together, I took a look back at what were we talking about in 1.0 marketing automation? What were we promising? And what's ironic is that we were promising exactly what we're talking about today. This idea that marketing automation could deliver dialogue, that was the key to nurturing. We also talked a lot about this idea that nurturing was a nonlinear type of operation. So marketing automation 1.0 absolutely had this vision of demand dialogue. But here are the challenges. In particular, and many Annuitas clients know, we've built some really sophisticated demand engines over the years. But the challenge is that it was always really a highly manual build to get to perpetual. And think about Visioing all the steps, mapping those out, building all those programs in Marketo and Eloqua and HubSpot, and then mapping together all these engagement channels, right? The work that we have done has always been multi-channel, not just email, but email plus web, bringing in paid, but a lot of complex steps to integrate all those channels from a mapping standpoint and also from the standpoint of keeping track of all the parameters. Also, with some of these channels, real-time API'd into the system, but in some cases, actually not. And all these complex batch uploads, the governance of that data, of that tracking, et cetera. And so let's talk about the fact that, we really hit a wall with 1.0 marketing automation. Some of the challenges we couldn't overcome. Those manual automation builds that we talked about also meant constant adjustments. Optimization in the engine was literally going in and manually making changes. So let's say you learned that different content performed differently at different stages of the buying journey. And once you had that live, you had the proof of that to then go on and make that change sometimes would be a significant lift. Also, I mentioned this before, but when we talk about a lot of the engagement channels and other pieces of the mix, we frequently have this batch integration problem. What I mean by that is that you might have a field event that's a critical part of the quote engine, but actually is not fully integrated. And so somebody would go out, do an event, there'd be a list to upload after the fact. And so one, you have this delay. Two, you have this data that's coming in a non-ideal way. And three, oftentimes you had gaps in the information that was collected. It was very fragmented. And so that's where you saw engagement channel activity and data very much in silos in a lot of our demand engines to date. Also, our efforts to qualify were very much using forms. And for our clients, we'd always try and do progressive forms, but we still found that they were a highly inefficient way to profile and to qualify. We would tune the heck out of the quality, but there were a lot of gaps from a qualification standpoint that we'd see. Also, all of this, particularly the paradigm of producing a lead, handing that to an SDR, that SDR or BDR or LDR, whatever you call them, having to then turn around and set a meeting, brief the seller. There were just too many gaps and breaks in that process, and it was not ideal end to end. And so you often had a state where there were so many chances that early stage engagement, which might be really significant and strong with the buyer, couldn't actually make its way to a strong seller engagement simply because of the demand process that was involved. We, in fact, often had sales disconnected, but we also had this double down effect, which is that sellers always acted disconnected, even as we would try and do all the change management and training, get everybody aligned, get the SDRs and sellers and marketing working together. there was still this sense that sales was like, oh, well, whatever marketing's doing, that's a separate thing. Disclaimed some of the knowledge about the state of the leads. And it was just a change management that I don't think we ever fully overcame, and often led to sales turning to their own cold outreach tools like SalesLoft, like outreach to go out there. So a lot of walls in the 1.0 version of a demand engine powered by marketing automation. Perhaps the worst part of this was the CAC issue, is that all of these elements really meant that the cost of acquisition and the steps it took to turn initial impressions and interactions into pipeline often were very costly. And a CAC issue for demand programs is in fact a CFO issue. And we see that, on the right is an example of an annuitous client, an actual annuitous client. And for our clients, we've always done incredibly well and had 4 to 10x improvement in our demand engines. But unfortunately, for a lot of the marketplace, their model looked like the left. And so when I say that a CAC problem, it was because they would spend a lot of money at the top and very little that would convert, this extreme martini glass. And so the cost of acquisition, the cost of demand programs oftentimes would be equal to or exceed the actual outcome that they were delivering on the other end. That CAC issue was a real problem for how CFOs saw a lot of 1.0 marketing automation powered demand engines. Amid all of this, we were trying to make some improvements in the marketplace. Our market automation demand engine started to see competition. ABM as a concept, ABM programs, ABM platforms started to really be an alternative parallel. And sometimes they were integrated, sometimes they were not. That demand engines were not meant to be account-based, but there was definitely some alternative approaches that were out there. Intent data represented an alternative approach that often for sellers work around an end run around demand programs. Hey, I've got intent on these accounts, I'm going directly. And then finally, we mentioned sellers doing cold outreach, sales cadence platforms. So I wanted to just frame up where we've been with marketing automation, with building demand engines, building perpetual demand over the last decade, and certainly, history for annuitous. A lot of great wins over that time period, but we've got to really acknowledge some of those challenges, the wall, and this competition from alternative approaches.